Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my regular update from Washington. I hope, first of all, let me say at the outset, I hope everybody's going to have a great and happy and safe Memorial Day. Got a couple topics I want to get into before we go to your questions. First, spent a lot of the last week traveling last weekend, for example, around Hampton Roads. Got updated on some of the progress that's being made at Jefferson Lab, which I think we will look back on as one of the greatest investments, maybe even of this century in Virginia. At the same time, grappled with some of the terribly challenging issues around childcare across the peninsula and Hampton Roads. Gave a graduation speech. Hopefully, graduates will take all my wisdom, including not being afraid to fail. Earlier this week, though, had a really interesting session at Marymount University, where we had other colleges from Northern Virginia, high school students, guidance counselors, and this is about the complete botched rollout of the FAFSA. That's the Federally Assisted Form for Student Aid. I know a lot about this since I'm the first member of my family to graduate from college, and I had to go and get student assistance. But what happened, and some people may not have followed this that closely, but there was a bill passed in 2020 to try to simplify the form, take it from 100 questions down to 13. End of the day, that would make it simpler, and frankly, the goal was to be able to get about 600,000 more Americans eligible for Pell Grants with this simpler form. The problem was, and talk about shades of Obamacare, the rollout was delayed literally for months on end. And then when it was rolled out, there were technical glitches. It begs the question why the federal government can't do big IT projects on time, on budget, or roll them out efficiently. And it's we've seen this movie before. The challenge I'm hearing from particularly first-generation students who need this financial assistance. They were running into the problem where they may have been accepted at a few schools but didn't have how much student assistance they were going to get. So how do they make a decision? If the preferred school, they don't know if they're going to get student aid or not. They're forced into decisions. The colleges now have all these staggered dates because the colleges have been thrown off as well. It's been a real debacle. The only thing, good news, I've been with the Secretary of Education. The processing time has gotten down from weeks to 1 to 3 days. There's still going to be some disruption. There's still going to be kids that probably will have to take a gap year because they didn't have all their financial forms. I encouraged all the students, hang in there, still fill out these forms. It will probably mean there'll be a lot more additional transfer students because people went to the school, they get aid, and they only find later that they maybe were able to get aid for their preferred school. So this is, again, one of those issues that I'm going to stay on top of and make sure the consumer experience and student experience is much, much better for the coming year. End of the day, we're talking about opportunity for these young people. I think about the fact is the opportunities that higher education gave me, I wouldn't be sitting here if I'd not been able to go to college. And looking at some of these young people who I think they're going to make it through, but these were the stars. A whole lot of their friends were saying they were kind of throwing in the towel. And when we had a project that the law passed in 2020, we roll it out in 24, and it still got screwed up. This needs a lot more further review. So that was one issue I wanted to raise. Second issue, in about 20 minutes, I will go take a vote on what was the bipartisan border security bill. I'm the first to acknowledge there is a mess at the border. We need to take more action. We need to have a better asylum process. We need to no longer have what's called catch and release, where people are coming across the border, getting a court date, potentially weeks, months, or in some cases years later. That system's just not working. And the irony is, my Republican senators and more the Republican House said we need a tough border bill. We need a tough border bill. Matter of fact, they demanded that as part of the price to get Ukraine aid. Well, it took a while, but a bipartisan bill was put together, And then former President Trump said, well, we don't want to fix the border really, because he'd rather use that as a political issue. And I find that outrageous. I know our vote today probably won't get Republican support, but I hope it will put people on the board on where they stand. I can also tell you, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, this is not only a problem around how communities are going to absorb these folks who come across, but it raises a national security issue because we don't have the same level of screening at the border that we have through traditional ports of entry. So my hope is that we will take that vote. I hope Americans, as they consider, who they're going to support coming up in elections, they'll look, all right, where did you stand on a tough border bill? A bill that I'd add, by the way, the Republican floor leader said was the toughest bill he'd seen and would be, frankly, a tougher bill than could have even gotten through under President Trump. So maybe after this vote today, we can get this reopened because we need stronger border protections. We need border security. We need to have a process that's fair, and we have none of that going on right now. The other small item, although kind of on a historic basis as well, we confirmed our 200th judge under President Biden's first 3.5 years in office. My hope is that we will be able to get more, and I think Donald Trump has the current record of 235. I would hope we'd be able to exceed that by the end of President Biden's 4 years. And I think what we've tried to do, and what I'm so proud of in these judges, is they look a lot more like America. I think everyone knew and celebrated Judge Ketanji Jackson, African-American woman on the Supreme Court. But right here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, one of the people that Tim Kaine and I were both proud to support was Jasmine Yoon, who is the first Asian American judge in Virginia. She came over here as an immigrant, literally in 8th grade, didn't speak a word of English, went on to get undergraduate and law degrees at UVA, a remarkable individual, a remarkable American success story. And she's been, again, overwhelmingly confirmed in a bipartisan basis by the Senate. So good news there on the judges front. Why don't I go ahead and throw it back to Laura and be happy to take your questions.
Senator, our first question is Hannah Brandt with Nexstar.
Hi, Senator Warner. Wanted to ask you about the DOJ's lawsuit against Live Nation and if you have any reaction to that.
Yeah, and listen, I've been on legislation for a while that says we need to have better consumer protections and we need to be concerned about concentration in industries where it appears this company like Ticketmaster charging way too high of fees. Seems like it's treats customers awfully. It may be a little bit of a commentary on where we are in our country that it took Taylor Swift and her fans, the Swifties, to get as upset as they did to maybe bring this to the full kind of attention it merits. But this Ticketmaster issue has been going on for years, and I support what the FTC is doing. I have spoken out repeatedly about the need to also look at some of our big tech company platforms. I think it was good news a month ago when we said on TikTok, a huge platform that ultimately controlled by the Communist Party of China, that needs to be sold to a non-CCP controlled entity. I think we still need child safety protections on Facebook and Google and other social media platforms. And the truth is, I was in business. I don't mind people making a profit, but when we have huge concentration in an industry to the point where it becomes a near monopoly, two things lose. Consumers lose because they get charged too much, and startups, entities that are trying to compete, lose because somebody with dominant market force doesn't allow the market to work, and there's not market competition. I'm an all-in markets guy, but the markets can only work if there's some fairness in it, and if you have the kind of concentration we've seen in some of these industries, there's no way, and I say this as a former venture capitalist, for any startup to ever be successful.
Senator, our next question is Megan Polly with Virginia Public Media.
Hey, good morning. Good afternoon. I'm working on a story on the Brown versus Board of Education Scholarship Committee's new funds and new awards. Was just hoping you could comment on the federal grant that was authorized to expand the program and if additional funds could be allocated in the future.
You've opened, I will only give you a 20-minute version. No, I won't give you the full 20 minutes. But the genesis of this Brown versus Board of Education scholarship was back when I was governor. And Ken Woodley, who was then the editor of the Farmville Herald, and a man with an enormous heart, said, we ought to do something. Since Virginia had closed down its schools rather than integrate, and a lot of this started, unfortunately, in Prince Edward County, where Farmville was located, we ought to provide a scholarship that would say to those individuals who lost literally years of schooling. It wasn't just in Prince Edward County. It was parts of Norfolk. There were parts of Northern Virginia. And massive resistance was one of the real scars in Virginia history in terms of racial justice. Ken had this outrageous idea to say, well, why can't we get a couple $1 million to give scholarships to these people who lost their education? If they can't use it, maybe their kids or grandkids. So I challenged the legislature to put up $1 million. There was a wonderful benefactor who put up $1 million of private capital. And the first time, the legislature turned it down. But I'm happy to say that I think we shamed them into putting up those funds, and that was back in 2003 or 4. Program goes on. Most of those funds have been drawn down. There are still individuals that were affected by massive resistance that still haven't had the educational opportunities. So being able to get this additional federal congressionally designated spending, or what we call earmark, I think will continue the legacy of righting the wrong of segregation and of massive resistance. And the fact that we are now on the 70th year anniversary of Brown v. Board, I think it's a very appropriate time to do that story, and I very much appreciate it. But it was a long and torturous path, and I have to tell you, when Ken Woodley first came to me, I thought, well, that's pretty out there. But the more time we spent with legislators, and ultimately, at the end of the day, even after we had to shame a few people the first time, by the second time, it was overwhelmingly passed in a bipartisan basis. But people like Ken and folks who are involved, I think about the Moten Museum, that I've been a proud personal supporter of, that commemorates one of the cases that was part of Brown versus Board of Education there in Farmville. People with heart, with a good idea, they can actually get things done, and I'm glad you're doing a story.
Senator, our next question is Garrett Whitten with CBS 19.
Senator, how are you?
Good.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on the situation with the tourists being arrested and facing time in Turks and Caicos for having ammunition found in their luggage. And do you think it says anything about the abilities of the United States TSA that let the bullets through in the first place?
Well, I think there is a question of how did someone get on. I know that the Virginia case was somebody who was on, I believe, a cruise ship. There were a couple of other cases where people flew in. How did they get through TSA screening with live ammunition? I think that's a very real question. But I also have to say that the government in Turks and Caicos, I think their policy is really to the extreme. And I've been working with Senator from Oklahoma, Markwayne Mullin, who has been leading the effort to try to get these Americans back. The one thing I will say is that Turks and Caicos was very clear in their signage that no exceptions you bring in unregistered ammunition or firearms, you're gonna be arrested. And they changed their law a number of months back because, as unfortunately as we've seen in our country and through the Caribbean, the level of gun violence has gone up dramatically. So I respect their country's right to have, tough gun laws. I wish in certain cases we had a little more reasonable approach at the federal level on things like assault weapons. But I think the idea that this individual, which seemed to be just made a mistake, would be suddenly, caught 12 years in a jail in Turks and Caicos is way over the top. And I'm going to work with other senators to do all we can to bring those folks back.
Senator, next question
Thank you.
is Mike Gooding with 13 News Now.
Hello there, Senator. Thanks for doing this. So next month in June, you Senate folks will begin work on the 25 NDAA. The Navy is proposing retiring 13 ships, 10 of them early, and only building 6 new ships. Sadly, only 1 new Virginia-class sub. Just wondering what you think of those numbers.
Well, Mike, let me, because I just had Carlos Del Toro, the Secretary of the Navy, who is a Virginian, in my office 2 weeks ago, and the actual prospect for how Virginia is going to do, I was very pleased. And I know, and then as well, when I'm talking about being in Hampton Roads last week at Huntington Ingalls, they are so backed up on new sub construction, both Virginia class, Ohio class, and others, that let me do, I don't want to just give it, listen, we obviously want to make sure we maintain the strongest Navy in the world in a time where there is conflict everywhere. We see the power of the Navy right now, trying to keep the level of violence in the Middle East down, and those are some of those carrier flotillas are ships at Homeport and Norfolk. We need to do all we can to have that strong Navy, and as many of those ships, submarines and aircraft carriers built in Virginia. But on the specifics there, if you wouldn't mind, I will be back to you, because I came away with a slightly different understanding of where we were standing, and have not, at length looked at what the DoD proposal. Usually that comes to me after it goes through the committee, but let me get on you and give you a better answer.
Senator, our
Fair
next
enough.
question is Amy Knowles. Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner,
Hey.
thanks for taking our questions. There's a term that we're hearing a lot as we're getting closer to the election, and that's foreign interference. I wondered if you could give some guidance on what that is and what the public could be on the lookout for, and if we notice something that seems off in that purview, who we should contact.
Well, thank you as always, Amy. First of all, don't believe everything you read on the internet. It's the number of people, and that's not foreign interference necessarily, but what oftentimes happens is somebody will pipe up, might be an American, some crazy theory or some over-the-top accusation. Now, as an American, they've got that First Amendment right to do that. But what oftentimes will then happen is the foreign government, and we're generally talking about Russia, China, Iran, to a lesser degree North Korea, and even some nation states that we have fairly decent relationships with, they will take through artificial intelligence tools, through some of their own kind of fake websites they have, and amplify some crazy statement where it suddenly gets traction on the internet. And you suddenly look at your trending news, and something that just seems bizarre is suddenly getting traction, and that may be reinforced by foreign amplification. Why are foreign governments doing this? Because it's a lot cheaper to try to hack into our systems or spread disinformation than it is answering, like to Mike's question, on buying a new aircraft carrier or submarine. And we've seen Russia do this effectively in 2016, in 2020. We were, frankly, I think a little better prepared. memories fade. There's even a whole host of people that somehow act like 2016 wasn't a major intervention by Russia. It was. I've got 5 bipartisan volumes from the Intelligence Committee that lays out in detail what the Russians did. So I am worried that people are getting lax. I'm also worried that with artificial intelligence tools, AI tools, so-called deep fakes, the ability to have a candidate say something or appear to say something that's just not that candidate is already out in the wild. Or the ability to have any of you as journalists, your face pop up, and if you're trusted in your community saying XYZ about politics, not you at all. So we have been working with the tech companies to try to have them put what's called watermarking so that if it doesn't have that watermark, it could be altered content. We even got a part of the bill into my Intel bill to say that if you strip off the watermark, that would be a civil penalty. So we are real time working this. If somebody sees something that they, especially about time and date of elections, that doesn't seem right, elections are always the first Tuesday in November. If we get closer to the election and somebody says, well, we're not going to vote that day, we're going to vote on Thursday, we'll call your local election board, call the state election board to get information. When it comes to questions about you see an ad and it doesn't have to be presidential candidates, it could be congressional candidates, it could be local candidates, and that local candidate for mayor, and I can't believe she would be saying that. I think it's important to kind of contact the candidate themselves, contact your local election officials. We don't have in place, again, we want to protect First Amendment rights. People can say what they want, but we don't have in place the kind of easy infrastructure to, find immediate information back about disinformation. There is the CISA, the cybersecurity and I forget all this. CISA, the cybersecurity agency, put out on a regular basis. You ought to check that site out. Myths about what's happening. They will sometimes put out indications of disinformation. But what we really need, Amy, is we need the Facebooks, as long as they're around, the TikToks, the YouTubes, all of the social media platforms to be responsible. And unfortunately, we've seen companies like Twitter that have walked away from any responsibility. They don't even have their users adhere to the standards they say you've got to operate on. So we've got all these companies that voluntarily agreed to, particularly with AI altered content, to take down altered content that's been manipulated. But I really worry it was all voluntary and the clock's a ticking. I've written all those 20 companies and I'm asking them specifically what have they done. The only thing that may be this isn't good for the world, but it may be good for us a little bit, that particularly Russia, we think will probably intervene in the European parliamentary elections in June to try to undercut support for Ukraine. The British have indicated that they're going to have an interesting date, their elections on July 4th. And there will be efforts, I think, since United Kingdom has been such a strong supporter of Ukraine, that the Russians may try to undermine in the UK. We may get a little bit of a preview, and we'll also be able to get a little bit of a preview of what these giant tech companies are doing to actually adhere to the promise they made me and other elected officials with much pomp and circumstance at the Munich Security Accord in February of this year. So I wish I had an easier one-stop shop of here's where you call. The truth is, as we all know, trying to figure out fact from fiction, even beyond political interference, even beyond foreign governments, to be consumers of news today, it's a hard, challenging task. Again, one of the reasons why I'm so worried about the fact that up to a third of our young people who are on TikTok get all of their news from TikTok. And if that's all you're listening to, and you don't think that algorithm can be slightly switched to promote pro-China or pro-Russia or anti-U.S. Messages, then I don't think you're familiar with what the reality of the world. And unfortunately, this is what I see as chairman of the Intelligence Committee on a daily basis.
Senator, our final question is from journalism students at Wakefield Country Day School in Rappahannock County.
Oh, great.
Good afternoon, Senator. Will Walford. I'm questioning on behalf of our high school journalism class. If the ban on TikTok goes through, do you think this sets a precedent for other social media organizations, even those owned by U.S. companies, as they may also pose a similar threat to spying or manipulation by AI? Thank you.
Well, Will, thank you for the question, and I'm glad you're on the line. I have felt for some time with American social media companies, we needed to put some guardrails in place. I think we need a kids' online safety legislation that would say, kids below a certain age maybe shouldn't have access to all of these sites. I think as well we ought to have things like data portability and interoperability. So if you got tired of Facebook and you wanted to go on a new site, you could easily transfer your data. There's some common sense rules of the road that we've not put in place even for the American social media platform. But I have no interest at all in banning or prohibiting their business. I think there's a lot of good that comes out of social media. The difference with TikTok is that TikTok, which is owned by ByteDance is a Chinese company. Chinese law said as of 2017, any Chinese company, their first obligation has to be to the Chinese government, which means the Chinese Communist Party. Not to shareholders, not to you or your students at your high school that may be using TikTok. They have no obligation to you. So what we passed was not a ban of TikTok, to be clear. I think there's a lot of creativity. I think there's a lot of social influencers. It simply says TikTok ought to be sold to a non-Chinese company. It could be an American company. Doesn't even have to be an American company. It could be a Canadian company, a Brazilian company. And I point out, Will, it's interesting. TikTok is not even allowed in China. They have a different version that's all about pro-studying. TikTok is already prohibited in India. Every major government has said if you use TikTok, you're potentially being spied upon, and they don't allow it for government use. I think we just ought to make sure that this creative platform has non-Chinese ownership, and honestly, about 40% of the current ownership of TikTok are American investors. I hope they would do the right thing and help this transaction take place. But in terms of American platforms, yes, I'd like to have things like kids online safety. I'd like to have a privacy bill so you've got some idea of where your data is going. I would like to have a reform of what's called Section 230. Will, if you follow this stuff, this was basically the law that said all of these platforms have no responsibility at all for any of their content. Even at your local high school paper, if you put out something that's a bold-faced lie, chances are you're going to get in trouble. And at these TV stations and radio stations, there are rules of the road around broadcasting. Shouldn't we at least have some similar rules of the road around these social media companies? But let me assure you, I have not heard any member of Congress from either political party say they want to try to, ban or prohibit any American social media company. But thanks so much for the question.
Senator, that was our final question.
All right, everybody, have a safe Memorial Day.